today I want to look at the various policymaking institutions and assess the effectiveness, and more than just assessing the effectiveness, look at the reasons for either the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness. We have a three-branch system of government, but there are really, I would say, 5 set of policymaking institutions within our 3 branches. 3 of them are in the executive branch. First, we have Congress, which is the legislative branch. And Congress is a bicameral legislature. We have the House, which has 435 members, elected to 2-year terms. We have the Senate, which has 100 members, elected to 6-year terms. The main areas of responsibility for Congress, as far as policymaking, is budgeting, creating programs, and some regulation. The executive branch contains 3 separate sets of policymaking institutions. First is the hierarchical set of cabinet departments, which are largely involved in carrying out programs. Now, there's policymaking power in carrying out programs because there's a lot of discretion in taking the programs as they're designed and putting them to the world. But this set of policymaking institutions actually has the least amount of policymaking power. This is the one that's most subservient to Congress. You can't, for example, build low-income housing if Congress hasn't given you the power to build low-income housing, or if it hasn't given you the funding to do so. So that's just one example. This is the most effective set of institutions at carrying out policy. And actually, the executive branch runs pretty well, right? There's a bureaucracy, there's red tape, there's some level of ineffectiveness built into a gigantic bureaucracy that covers the entire nation and does a zillion things. But there's inefficiency in every large set of institutions. There's inefficiency in private corporations as well. The larger they get, the more likely they are to have these bureaucratic inefficiencies. So this is pretty decent, but largely because there's very little actual policymaking power here, and mostly just execution. The second set is also hierarchical, and this is the foreign policy establishment. Now, this is a little bit more varied. It also contains the intelligence community, as well as some advisors. The foreign policy making institutions are more complicated than the cabinet departments, which are pretty much straightforward. President, cabinet secretary, policymakers, bureaucrats, and civil servants carrying things out. The foreign policy establishment has an awful lot of power. In fact, one of the things about our constitutional system is that policy-making power in foreign policy is divided between the presidency and the foreign policy-making institutions and Congress, but over time and through circumstances, and particularly through the growth of the United States military and economic power, that has moved over from here to here, right? And so the foreign policy-making establishment has almost sole power. Now, one of the things that's true about this set of institutions as well, not only is it more complicated, but we know that we have a diversity of views. And this is one of the things that makes foreign policy making effective, but also potentially problematic. It's effective because the problems the United States faces globally, or in any particular region, are complex and changing. Diversity of views is a power in that because it gives us a lot of different inputs, gives the president, who's the center of this, right, not just the top of the pyramid, but the center of this system, a lot of different options and ideas and perspectives to make better decisions. So, in a way, the diversity helps it make it more effective. The fact that it's the sole policy-making power also makes it effective because the things that make Congress ineffective and don't infect foreign policy, the kinds of disputes that often make Congress unable to take effective policy action, don't infect foreign policy, which is good because foreign policy is much more fluid, much more unpredictable, and much more complex than domestic policy. And so removing the normal sort of interest group and partisan politics that dominate Congress, removing that from foreign policy removes an obstacle to effective decision-making. The diversity of views also potentially makes this a problematic system of or set of institutions because we have conflict. And conflict can sometimes lead to either inaction or it can lead to pulling in different directions or it can lead to a dissipation of energy and essentially working against each other. So there are things that come out of this. One of the things that is very true about the foreign policy establishment is it really is centered around the president. When it comes to cabinet departments, which are dealing with carrying out domestic programs, the president is really subservient, and the entire executive branch is really subservient to Congress. This is where the president's domestic agenda is subject to the ability of the president and other leaders within the executive branch to effectively lobby Congress for legislation, regulation, and budgets to carry out what they think is the right thing to do. So the president here is not really the president's the top of the pyramid, but the real top of the pyramid is Congress. And so there's little power here, but the president really is, to once again quote George Bush, really is the decider in this system. And that's good and bad. Why is that good? Because then there is a decider. Exactly. Having a person making the final decision is a more effective way of making policy. A lot of times, even if you choose a mistake, you're better off choosing a mistake that you then, in a unified way, move towards, then you can learn from your mistake in a unified way, than you are having 5 or 10 or 535 different voices. Right? There is actually somebody making the final decision. That's not true here, because the final decision is left to Congress. And it's definitely not true here because there's no one person or even one small group of people who have the final choice. So that makes this effective. What makes it ineffective? If that person makes bad choices, then we're doubly screwed, right? And I think that the difference between, say, the first President Bush, who was a very effective foreign policy president with a lot of experience and connections and knowledge and the ability to work with all the different groups and balance all those different views and make good decisions, and his son, who was unable to do so and who actually eschewed the diversity of views in favor of a small group of core advisors who all had the same set of ideas and perspectives, largely drawn from the civilian policymaking area of the Defense Department, then we get bad decisions. One of the things that actually is problematic here, right, so it's very presidential-centered, is that the president is elected by the people. What does the direct election of the president do for the president's ability to be a good foreign policy decider? What do American voters care most about? Domestic policy, right? Foreign policy is a very abstract thing. It's very difficult to think of foreign policy as having a lot to do with yourself, except for national security, right? But that's pretty well taken care of. Most Americans pay more attention to this role, so this is the focus of voters' attention on the presidential candidates. And what gets you elected president is the thing that you have the least control over and that you're most subservient to other elected officials, which is your domestic agenda. What you say you're going to do about taxes, spending, social programs, defense budgets, healthcare, the environment, gay marriage. None of that stuff is directly under the control of the president. And in fact, what Americans actually love, what we tend to like, are people who have a domestic policy agenda that we dig, but who come from outside of Washington because there's a lot of frustration here, right? They directly elect these people, but there's massive frustration underlying our elections of Congress and our view of Congress. People tend to focus on domestic policy because it matters more to them. They tend to also want an outsider, somebody who doesn't come from this system, which is very frustrating. So we get, one, presidents who are elected because of their least powerful role and who are chosen from a group of people who have the least experience in doing what this presidential role requires the most, which is getting Congress to give the executive branch what it wants. So as a domestic policy maker, the president is already weak constitutionally, and in terms of real electoral politics, the president is not a very effective leader here. We like people who will tell us that they're going to do the stuff we want them to do, but unfortunately, they're telling us the things that Congress is supposed to do. And they can tell us that stuff and we can believe it, oddly, ironically I think, because they actually come from outside of this system. They're more believable the less connected they are to this system. Americans don't like career politicians as presidential candidates. Barack Obama had a huge advantage because even though he was a senator, he was only had been in the Senate for 4 years. And he was young and an outsider for sure, right? He had a huge advantage against John McCain, who was the consummate insider. People like Mitt Romney. And in fact, one of the things that helped Mitt Romney in the Republican primaries was that he wasn't tied up with all of the interests in Congress. Newt Gingrich tried to present himself as the most anti-establishment candidate of the Republicans, but he was the Speaker of the House. It doesn't get more establishment than that. Rick Santorum had trouble because he was pegged with a voting record and behavior in the Senate. He was part of the problem. He was easily pegged as part of the problem, as well as not being a person who had private sector experience. So we like outsiders. We don't typically get people with this kind of experience. So we have a decider, and that's good. We have a foreign policy establishment that's largely immunized from democratic politics and partisan politics. There's the ability to act in an effective, concerted way, but the leader of this system doesn't have experience. So we're lucky when we get a good foreign policy president. President Obama will be seen as a pretty effective foreign policy president. He's a fast learner. He's a smart guy. He's a person who, by temperament and by training, has come to value diversity of views and who has the intellectual capacity to take a vigorous debate and turn it into a decision. He's no Jimmy Carter. Right? People worried, oh, he's going to be just like Jimmy Carter. One of Jimmy Carter's problems was he was a micromanager and also not very good at taking the diversity of views and turning it into a decisive policy. President Obama, by all accounts, and from everything that I've read about as well as sort of seen in terms of action, is able to encourage a vigorous debate, but then at the end of the debate, make a decision and stick to it and go forward with it. And that's actually a pretty amazing set of skills. He did not get elected for that. We just happened to be lucky. He got elected despite the fact that he's smart and despite the fact that he's good at listening and doing this stuff. Actually, being too smart in American politics can be a handicap, strangely enough, right? Bill Clinton, super smart guy. He hid that. It was helpful that he had the big neck and the red face and the hillbilly look to hide how smart he was. But that was part of what he had to do. Bill Clinton was very smart. He was not a very effective foreign policy president, though. Not terrible, but no George W. Bush, but not super effective either, because he didn't even care about this. He focused on domestic policy. He even said in his first year in office, I didn't come here to do foreign policy. It was the post-Cold War period. We didn't worry about it. He basically just said, I'm here to do this stuff. And he struggled. Our foreign policy is subject to democratic politics that are not focused on foreign policy experience. But the counterbalance to that, and I think the reason we can say that our foreign policy establishment is the most effective of all of our institutions, is that the establishment itself is stacked with people with a lot of experience and knowledge, and different viewpoints that give them all a high level of expertise. So that even when the president is not experienced and not necessarily very smart, the foreign policy establishment fills in and makes up for that. Our foreign policy making establishment is quite effective. The third set of the policy making institutions within the executive branch is the independent agencies. These are not under presidential control. One of the interesting things is that an entire set of policy-making institutions has been created that is doing part of Congress's job that doesn't have the president as a main player. The president is a secondary player. The president has an appointment power that runs through the Senate. This is a pretty much independent set of policy-making institutions. The independent agencies have the ability to make regulations. How effective are independent agencies at doing their job at making policy? Independent agencies are actually typically run by policy experts who are immune, relatively immune anyway, from political pressure. They typically have the ability not only to make expert-based determinations, but their policy largely, and it varies. It's a very diverse set of institutions that have a different design and different regulatory mandates. But typically, by being immune from political pressure, they can not only be effective at making decisions, just like the foreign policy establishment can, but they can also be proactive. And this is one of the things that's interesting about many of the independent agencies, is that they can actually say, oh, here's a problem that's coming up. We know that this is going to get worse. Let's deal with it. The FCC, I think, is a poster child of proactiveness. It's always surprising to me how good the FCC is. The FCC is facing the changing landscape of telecommunications in the United States, and actually, instead of just trying to run to catch up and basically figure out, oh, how do we regulate in the world as it is today, the FCC is looking ahead at 5 and 10 and 20 years into the future, knowing that there's a lot of changes coming and that there are major challenges, and trying to get out ahead of that. And that's because the commissioners are almost completely immune from political pressure. They have to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They have to go through the political system to get there. But the FCC membership is statutorily balanced by party membership. There have to be at least 2 from each party, and so there can't be party dominance. And so in a way, they are really immune from political pressure, because if a Republican seat comes open and there's a Democratic president, that Democratic president has to find a Republican to put on the FCC, which means setting aside politics and looking for somebody who actually is good in this area. These independent agencies are subject to Congress's overall regulatory power, but because Congress has a hard time getting its act together in many ways, they are really immune from that political pressure indirectly. They're, of course, directly subject to that. There are other agencies that are more subject to political pressure because the policy that they're making is more controversial. And I think the EPA is a good example of that. The EPA is an independent agency, but environmental policy is very controversial. And there's always the likelihood, and in fact, the reality that Congress is going to interfere with with environmental policy. Because environmental policy actually, in a lot of ways, crosses party lines. There are a lot of Democrats who also have a problem with environmental regulation because it's costly, because it hurts people back home. It is perceived, and in some cases it really is, but it's definitely perceived as being problematic for economic growth and for jobs. What's interesting is that in the 60s and into the early 1970s, there was a bipartisan consensus that environmental regulation was a good thing. There were a lot of Republicans who were in favor of environmental protection. President Nixon was one of the most committed to environmental protection. Conservation largely. He created the EPA for the same reason that President Bush created the department, or pushed Congress to create the Department of Homeland Security. The environmental protection establishment was decentralized. It had grown up piecemeal over the course of 60 years from the first environmental regulations in the early 20th century, and there were little bits here and there, and it wasn't a centralized, effective form or set of institutions for making a concerted, unified push towards environmental protection. And so President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency to bring all of these different agencies into one place and created a large independent agency. He did so partly because he thought he could better control. Nixon was a control freak in a lot of ways. He thought he could better control environmental policy if it was centralized, and that's true. But also because he had to reorganize the environmental institutions, environmental protection institutions, with congressional approval, it was put into an independent agency. And so Nixon's goal of effective policymaking, centralized, was achieved. His other goal of being able to be in control of environmental policy was thwarted by congressional action. So we kind of got, in that case, political agendas that ended up with a good thing. But the EPA is subject to pressure, for sure, particularly budgetary pressure. So it ranges. It depends. The Federal Reserve is very independent and was intentionally designed that way, with a very complex system of checks and balances to make sure that it could be independent, but could also not be corrupted or could not run away and just do whatever the heck it wanted without any kind of set of control. This is pretty good system. Why do we have this? We have this because members of Congress knew that with the changing world, with the growing complexity of society, technology, the federal government's place in the American system, the American economy, that effective policy making had to happen. We had to have proactive, we also had to have flexible and fluid policymaking institutions. And so this was created for exactly this reason, to get experts who are largely immune from crippling political pressure. So we can give Congress some stars, a couple of bonus points for having the wherewithal and the awareness to do this. Because one of the things about this is a non-constitutional set of institutions. In fact, in a way, it transforms the spirit of the Constitution away from what the founders wanted it to be, which was the directly elected, most politically responsive officials, Congress, would be in charge of the fundamental actions of government, which are making the laws, setting policy, setting budgets. These are the folks who are supposed to have the foundational power because this is the most democratic. This set of institutions is still subject to the power of Congress, and so it's under democratic control, but it is largely technocratic. Right? These are experts who are immune from political pressure. The legislature realized the limits of democracy for solving policy problems and taking effective policy actions, and created a technocracy that has grown in size and scope and power over the last 100 years since it was first created because of the recognition of the inherent limits of democracy for solving policy problems. So one of the things that I think is funny about our system is that we have a democratic system that is not well suited to the fundamental job of the federal government, which is making effective policy. But that, to a certain extent, that democratic system has produced an awareness that we need to create a non-democratic system to effectively solve problems. That's also happened with the sort of transition of foreign policy making power as a division between Congress and the executive branch, where we now have almost all foreign policy making power centralized in the executive branch. That has happened for similar reasons. Here, we essentially have a parliamentary monarchy as a central system. Right? The president is not the king and is elected, right? But it has a monarchical style of power when it comes to foreign policy making decisions. Congress doesn't have to be consulted when it comes to the use of troops. Congress doesn't have to be asked, should we shoot Osama bin Laden in the head or not? Congress doesn't have to be asked, should we send troops to Haiti to help out with the humanitarian relief? Congress doesn't have to be asked whether we should provide air support for rebels in Libya. One of the things that we can see is that if you look closely at the various kinds of decisions that are made, our two least democratic institutions, the decisions they make that are not effective are the ones that are the most subject to political pressure. The EPA is less effective than the FCC. The EPA is subject to more political pressure because environmental policy is more controversial, and there's a kind of a bipartisan objection to some environmental regulation. The problems with environmental regulation stem from core constituencies within both the Democratic and the Republican parties. In the Republican Party, the objection starting in the mid-1970s to environmental regulation was that it imposed large costs on American industry, American companies, to comply with these regulations. It was thwarting vigorous economic growth, and so they didn't like it. The problem within the core constituency of the Democratic Party came from the labor unions, which felt that environmental regulations were largely potentially job-killing. They had an effect to slow growth in wages for the same reason that companies had a problem with it, is that they slowed economic growth and they cost an awful lot. So both labor leaders and business leaders came to dislike environmental regulations. And because those are core constituencies within both parties came to have a problem with environmental regulation. So the EPA has a tougher job now than it did in the late 1960s, which is interesting because things are worse now. There's a greater public awareness of the need for environmental protection and effective, proactive solutions to environmental problems. And yet politicians have gone the other way because within both parties, the core constituencies of those parties have a major problem with environmental regulation. That produces a bipartisan consensus. Environmental policy is an example of how we can get a consensus between normally opposed interest groups and normally combative parties, and that consensus could be destructive to policymaking, not constructive. Labor unions and business leaders don't like environmental regulations for the same reasons largely, similar reasons anyway, overlapping reasons. And so we get effective democratic action. Congress is effective at preventing the EPA from doing a lot more. And Congress also has not expanded our environmental regulation. There's actually been a sort of not only a halting, but a rollback of environmental regulation since the mid-1970s. As this shift took place. Another consensus that emerged in the 1990s was for deregulation or non-regulation of the financial industry. Partisan politics particularly, based on views within both the core constituencies of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, produced this notion that we should deregulate the financial industry and we should not regulate emerging innovative areas of the financial industry because that was one of the primary factors producing economic growth in the United States because of structural changes. And so sometimes we can either get a consensus or we get a deep divide. There are one of two things that happens as a result of these, and they both happen. When there's a consensus, we get effective action. When there's a deep divide, we get the status quo, or worse, complete gridlock. It would be nice to think that when there's a consensus of interest groups, different interest groups like business and labor, and when there's an overlap in policy views between Democrats and Republicans, that would mean that there was effective policy choices, that when we get policymaking results, they would be good, but in some major ways, policymaking results lead to problems, such as the financial crisis or environmental stagnation. We really should have far more effective environmental regulation in this country now than we did in the early 1970s, but it's the opposite is the case. Now, that's not to say that this always happens, always results in problems. Sometimes we get good solutions. I think that one of the areas where there was a bipartisan consensus in the 1990s, starting in the 1980s and emerging in the 1990s, was that there should be deregulation and an unleashing of innovation in the telecommunications industry. And one of the major pieces of legislation that came out of President Clinton working with Republicans in Congress was the Telecommunications Act. And what the Telecommunications Act got us was massive innovation in telecommunications. It got us internet development, cell phones, smartphones, better broadband services, cheaper, more affordable telecommunication services across the board. That was an area where there was a consensus and it produced pretty good results. Policymaking results sometimes are good and sometimes bad. What's the fourth set of policymaking institutions? The judicial branch. The federal judiciary, which is hierarchical. Supreme Court, circuit courts, and district courts, or trial courts. This is a different sort of policymaking institution than the other four. What the judiciary typically does, there is some policymaking power. Sometimes the judiciary says, here's what you have to do. So there is some ability to make rules. But mostly what's done here is settle policy disputes that exist typically between the people and the government. And that's putting it broadly, that's kind of the broad category. What usually happens in a specific policy dispute is there is some segment of the people, some interest group, and some particular institution. For example, a group of civil rights activists and school boards. And the civil rights activists don't want the school boards to have segregated schools anymore. This is a policy dispute. How do we organize our public education system? How do we decide where to send people? That's policymaking. The dispute here is between elected officials, school board members, and state legislatures, and interest groups. The civil rights group effectively wins this battle, Brown versus Board of Education. This is just one example. Another one, more recent, Citizens United versus FEC, is an interest group, people who are political activists versus the Federal Election Commission. the Federal Election Commission is an independent agency, not an elected branch, but it could be any particular institution. And in this case, the judiciary settles the dispute between these political activists who want less restriction, less government restriction, fewer rules, and this institution, the FEC, that is enforcing congressional mandates and wants there to be effective policing, effective enforcement of these rules, and the court decides in favor of the people again. And actually, it doesn't always work out that way. Both of the examples I've given you are that the people have won, but often the government institutions win these fights. It's balanced. The courts are inherently not proactive. They're inherently reactive. There's a doctrine of judicial passivity which requires courts to wait for these disputes to come. So what we don't get is we don't get courts jumping into the policymaking fray. They are reactive, but they produce a high level of stability. What they say goes for a really long time. And in a way, that's a good thing broadly, because what it means is we get a final answer. We don't get an ongoing conflict in a particular area. We get a final answer, and we get a stable final answer that requires long-term activism to transform. When the pro-choice activists won in Roe versus Wade, right, we get for generations, at least 2, 3 full generations of Americans, we get that women have the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy or not. A lot of stability. Now, if you are on the winning side, you like that. If you're on the losing side, you don't like that. And one thing it's hard to say is, are the choices of the judiciary the best ones? But overall, what we get out of this system is we get a high level of stability. We get answers to policy disputes that remain in place for a good long time. And that's, by itself, that's a pretty good value. Because even when you're on the losing side, things are predictable. And you know what you're working against. And also, you know that the world is going to be that same way pretty much year after year. Right? So, if you're a winner, you love it. If you're a loser, you don't like it. But society in general and the policymaking environment benefits from this. Now, the model, we have a democratic model, we have a dictatorial model, we have a technocratic model. The model that we have with the judiciary is what I would call an independent philosophical model. The judiciary is subject to political pressure, political input, just like the independent agencies are, because the president appoints every judge, and every judge is approved by the Senate. But once you're here, you're completely independent. The judiciary is entirely immune from political pressure. And that's not only true constitutionally, that's proven to be true historically. Judges are very independent. They often don't even think about what the public would like. In rare cases, does the Supreme Court pay attention to the problem that might result from its rulings? But mostly what the Supreme Court pays attention to, and what the circuit courts as well pay attention to, are what do we think the Constitution means? Right? So we have an independent philosophical model that's based on the text of the U.S. Constitution. That's the foundation of it. The judiciary has a lot of room to work because the text of the U.S. Constitution is pretty open-ended in a lot of ways. But it has a text to work with. And it's independent. And largely, judges are, in fact, philosophical types. They wear the black robes, not just because they like the freedom of it, but because it's symbolic of the fact that they are, in a way, weirdos in our society. They are our society's philosophers. These people are involved in the political system, right? But one, they are legal minds, not political minds. And two, they're working with the text of the U.S. Constitution, not the people. Politicians are working with the people. That's their text, right? The background thing that they're trying to interpret is, what do the people want? And the people are shifting, right? Talk about open-ended. The Constitution is somewhat vague in some places and pretty straightforward in other places. And overall, it's flexible. But the people are completely flexible and change from week to week. So legal minds, judicial reasoning is very different from political reasoning. And that's actually one of the things that makes there be tensions between the judiciary and the other policymaking institutions, is that if you're a judicial conservative, you're different than a political conservative. If you're a judicial liberal, you're different than a political liberal. Right? Now, there are overlaps, but there are big differences as well. For example, if you're a judicial conservative who reads the Second Amendment as giving Americans a strong right to own guns, that regulations on personal gun ownership are presumed to be an invasion of a protected form of liberty. And that's pretty much what a judicial conservative will say on the Second Amendment. Judicial liberals will also say that a lot of times too, because judicial liberals are civil libertarians. Judicial liberals and judicial conservatives actually overlap a lot more in a lot more areas than political liberals and political conservatives overlap. But if you're a judicial conservative and you're in favor of strong Second Amendment rights, if you're a political conservative, at one point in time, being a political conservative could mean, and did mean, and has meant, and probably will mean again, being tough on crime and a law and order type politician. If the crime rate is high, and you're a political conservative, you're going to respond to, and in fact probably create the desire for, more effective policing. What is more effective policing? More rules, more power, more government power. A judicial conservative is against government power. They're for personal liberty to own guns. So a judicial conservative and a political conservative will clash. Now, in the current political environment, political conservatives who are in favor of gun owner rights and judicial conservatives overlap. But that has not been the case for forever, and it may not be the case again. Right? One of the reasons why political conservatives are so against gun control restrictions is because the crime rate in the United States has gone way, way down since its peak, and Americans don't worry so much about crime. We worry more about the economy. We worry more about the globe melting. We worry more about getting sick and dying. We worry more about terrorism. We don't worry about crime anymore. Crime rates have gone down significantly, particularly property crime, right? And there's just not that big of a worry, right? Because this set of institutions is the end of the line, right? They do really settle policy disputes in not a final way. Right? Roe versus Wade is not written into stone forever. It's still subject to transformation. But we get long-term stability in these doctrines. And that's entirely because the judiciary is so independent and the power model is a philosophical one. Judges are thinking about, what does the Constitution mean? Not what do people want. Not what's a social problem right now and how do we solve it, right? Do we solve it with more police? Do we solve it with more taxes? Do we solve it with less taxes? Do we solve it with more regulation? They just say, what does the Constitution allow? What does it forbid? And of course, there's differences of opinion on that. So there's not unity. We don't have a bunch of philosophers who all agree with each other. But we have a pretty regularized mechanism for resolving the disagreements among these philosophers. And we have a final word. One of the interesting things about our system is that good grades so far go to less democratic institutions. Democracy is awesome in a lot of ways. It's not awesome as an effective policy-making system. I would say that Congress is average, or maybe just above average, slightly above average, in terms of solving problems. Because there is this, right? We do get good solutions sometimes. Sometimes we get problematic solutions. A lot of times we get gridlock. One of the reasons why Congress is so frustrating to people is because this is highly visible. And the failures are highly visible. When we get a financial crisis that is the result of a lack of financial regulation, or in fact, actual active deregulation, we point our finger at Congress and say, you let us down, you screwed up, you created this problem. When we see the government unable to take vigorous action to solve a problem, we've got a rising healthcare crisis, we've got an education and literacy crisis, we've got an environmental crisis, and we get gridlock because there's a deep divide between the parties and interest groups, then we see that as well. Most people aren't going to say, oh yeah, thank you, Congress, for my cell phone. Thank you, Congress, for low airline prices and high mobility. That's one of the perversities of democracy, is that success is usually hidden and failure is transparent. Right? I think I've used this example before. How many of you drive down a nice smooth road and say, thank you, government, for this beautiful smooth road? No. How many of you drive down a pothole-ridden road and go, goddamn government, can't keep a smooth road? That's what happens. Now, that's not to say, I don't want to make an excuse, there's definitely a lot of this. Now, what are the sources of the gridlock? Why does it take a high level of consensus to get anything done instead of effective solutions? Democracy. But not just democracy. Right? Democracy is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that the people have the most direct control over this. Right? This is where the people really have power here. The people have almost no power over these dudes. Very little, very stupendously indirect. Right? Most people don't vote for the president based on the president's views on judicial appointments. It's an issue. It comes up. It's one of the things that presidents talk about, right? And Democratic candidates and Republican candidates speak differently about their judicial appointments. But most people don't vote based on that. Most people definitely don't vote for their senators based on what the senator's confirmation record is. That's just not the kind of thing. Imagine the political commercial that does that. Senator Miller has routinely voted to strike or to block the president's judicial confirmations, and we have a crisis in the judiciary because there aren't enough judges in the circuit courts. Vote against Senator Miller. Not very good. Right? That's not going to work unless, for some reason, that is a critical issue right now, and it will probably only be a critical issue for one election. The people have the most power over this group of people, and so Congress is, in a way, it's the most democratic, it's also the most responsive to public opinion. What that means is that policy making in this set of institutions, these two institutions, is driven by public opinion. Are the people the best policymakers? Sadly, no. Right? Human beings are pretty tremendous in a lot of ways. Not so tremendous in other ways. Definitely one of the biggest problems, and this is true not just in the United States, but everywhere, is that people tend to respond to short-term stimuli. People tend to think about problems when the problems arise, not before problems arise. And more importantly, I think for any democratic society that is so heterogeneous such as ours, there is no such thing as public opinion. There's no thing that the people say. There's no we the people. I write the people up here, but what is the people? The people are conflicting interest groups. There are people who have all kinds of interests that conflict with each other, and ideas that conflict. Should American society be a decent, civilized, humane, spiritual place where people respect their elders, where people love their families, where people remain committed to their communities, where people pursue higher spiritual truths rather than pleasure and personal gratification? There are some people who think that, and that sounds good, right? Family values, traditional values, which is kind of what I've just outlined, if you put it nicely, it sounds good. Or do we want to have a society where people get to make their own choices, where people get to pursue what they want, their individual pursuit, which is a lot of times going to be pleasure? Those are conflicting views. And there is a huge continuum, right? There are two big groups that each have a very strong view. We have a giant group of evangelicals in this country. About a fifth of the country are Christian evangelicals who believe in a particular vision of how all Americans should live their lives. They are counterbalanced by a sizable minority of pretty hardcore libertarians who believe that people should just be able to do what they want without any interference whatsoever. And most people are somewhere in between, the other 60% of Americans. But those 60% of Americans aren't the middle that all agrees with each other. Moderates are actually the most diverse group of people that there are. The people is deeply divided. So Congress is the most responsive to what we could really think of as a short-term, reactive, multiple personality disorder That's what the American people are, right? We have ADD and we have multiple personality disorder, among other problems, as a people. Now, that's not to say that we're bad, right? That's just the nature of a large, heterogeneous population and a political society, I should say a political culture, that has a variety of values which don't always perfectly jive with each other. Freedom. Do what you want. Live your life the way you want to. Equality. That's great too. Everybody has equal opportunities. Everybody has equal rights. Freedom and equality don't play well together, necessarily. In fact, freedom produces a lot of inequality. Generating equality requires taking away people's freedom. So it's not just that we have a short attention span and that we're diverse. It's that our political values are also, in a way, in conflict. Congress is at the center of this swirling conflict. And it should be no wonder that there's a lot of gridlock, that there's little consensus, that there's mostly a deep divide. That's actually one of the reasons why we have non-democratic institutions to make policy. That's not to say that that's the only problem. Okay? One of the problems is that public opinion is very divided. The people are a conflicting set of interest groups with different material and ideological interests. Another problem is the specific electoral system. Congress is the result of a winner-take-all, district-based electoral system. What that means is that the people who get to be here, the 435 members of the House, the 100 members of the Senate, are filtered by a particular electoral mechanism that produces certain relatively predictable outcomes. One of the predictable outcomes that results from this electoral system is a two-party system. When you have to win the most votes in a district to get elected, the incentive is to put together a large party coalition to get the most votes. What that means is that the choice that the people have, the elections, is pretty blunt. While the people have a big level of influence here, this is a blunt choice. I either choose the Democrat or the Republican, or I choose to throw away my vote on someone else. That's the choice you face. Or you choose not to vote at all. All four of those choices make sense to different groups of people. Some people are like, okay, I'll choose the Democrat, lesser of two evils. I'll choose the Republican, lesser of two evils. This person is less objectionable to me. Very rarely do people say, this person is who I really want. Certainly down the line, that's very difficult. Any one candidate is going to stand in a variety of ways that fit with your views, your ideas and interests, and don't go with your views, your ideas and interests. Right? There's no perfect candidate for anybody. And if you think there's a perfect candidate for you, you're in for a disappointment. That was one of the things that happened to a lot of strong liberals who were for Obama. They thought, this is our guy. He lines up with me all the way down the line. And it turns out that he lines up with you 2/3 of the way, or 40% of the way, which is not so bad. But you're either voting for the Democrat because the Democrat's the lesser of two evils, or the Republican because the Republican's the lesser of two evils, or you're throwing away your vote on a third-party candidate, hoping upon hope to transform the two-party system into a meaningful multi-party system, which isn't going to happen. Or you say, screw it, I'm not going to vote. I don't want to vote for somebody that I hate less than somebody else. I don't want to throw away my vote. I'm just not going to do it. 1/3 to half of Americans make that choice. So that already cuts down the people into a smaller group. It cuts down the voters, because this is all voting, they directly elect, into a group of people who actually think that it's worthwhile to make this blunt choice in the first place. The winner-take-all system also, and this is one thing I did talk about quite a bit in this class, is it creates for us a system where we have safe seats and swing seats. Because of the political demographics, the way people distribute themselves, there are places where in the district, because we have a district-based voting system, where there's a heavy load of Republicans or a heavy load of Democrats. And so the Democrat is going to win or the Republican is going to win. Most House seats are safe. Roughly 2/3 of the House seats are safe. That means that only 1/3 of 1/2 of Congress is up for grabs. When you live in when you're a politician in a safe district, you will tend to be more extreme because you're appealing to a group of voters who all fall on one side of the continuum, or largely fall on one side of the continuum. And so your incentive as a politician is to be in line with their expectations, and sometimes even be stronger than their expectations, so that you can win again and again. So what we get is most people have extreme views. A third of the House, roughly, it varies a little bit, but about a third of the House are swing districts. So a third of members of the House of Representatives have to appeal to people who are in the middle, and on the left and on the right, to get elected. And so they tend to be more moderates. If you have to, or more modest even, just don't say a whole lot, right? But that's not the norm here. So the House is very divided. And when you have extremists, that's a pathway to the deep divide. Because we don't have a society where one group of extremists dominates. We don't have a liberal dominance or a conservative dominance. We used to. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, the Republican Party dominated national politics. The American electorate, not the people necessarily, but the electorate, the people who voted, were much more strongly in favor of Republicans. Republicans won national elections all the time. Dominated Congress, dominated the presidency. Since the New Deal, since the Great Depression, the Democratic Party dominated, the liberals dominated, until the 1970s, when in fact the two sides became more balanced. For 40 years we had a conservative majority. For 40 years we had a liberal majority. Now we have a deeply divided population. For a large part of American history, Congress would have gotten a better grade. Because while we would have had extremists in the House, those extremists would have actually been mostly on one side. And so there would have been the ability to effectively move forward. And that's what we had. That's not true so much anymore. Now, the Senate is mostly swing because most states have a diverse enough population that to become a senator, you have to appeal to people in the middle, people on the left, people on the right. Districts tend to be much more homogeneous. States tend to be much more heterogeneous. Like the country itself, most states are a good reflection of the whole country in terms of political demographics. And so what we get here is we get moderates, which means that right away, the two groups of people who have to agree on all legislation, who have to do this stuff, who have to pass budgets, who have to create and fund programs, and who have to regulate, they have different political personalities. Add to that the fact that in the Senate, there's also the filibuster, which means that you actually have to have a supermajority to get legislation passed, and we're going to have a deep divide that results from differences between these two groups, as well as the ability of the Senate to block meaningful legislation. The filibuster means there's got to be a really high level of consensus among people from different parties, no matter what. Very rarely, because we have more moderates, is there majority control, strong majority control of the Senate in one way or the other. During the 1960s, starting with the 1964 congressional elections, the Democratic Party controlled a filibuster and veto-proof majority for a decade. And what we got was the Great Society. We also got the Vietnam War. For a decade, the filibuster was not a problem, and Democrats dominated this. But that's a rarity, and that's gone away. And it's really unlikely that either party in the foreseeable future will have 65, 66, 67 Senate seats. That comes from two sources. It comes from our heterogeneous political society. It comes from the particulars of our electoral system. Both of them are democracy, though. Democracy is the problem. The great thing, though, is this, that Congress really is the foundational power. Congress controls budgets for everybody. Congress passes the laws that are being dealt with here. Congress can ignore what the Supreme Court says. In Citizens United versus FEC, the Supreme Court set aside certain campaign finance regulations. Well, Congress could have just repassed them and said, nope, here they are again. Here, FEC, enforce these rules until the Supreme Court could deal with it again. And then if they struck it down again, Congress would just repass it. So if the political branch doesn't like what the independent philosophical branch is doing, it has the power to change it. If the technocrats are doing things that the politicians don't like, the technocrats' power can be taken away. We do have fundamental democratic control over the entire system, which is good, because when you have a technocratic system without meaningful checks, then the experts don't have to pay attention to the people. They don't have to pay attention to the effects of their choices. And experts are good at solving problems, but experts are bad at thinking about people and the effects that their decisions might have on people. That's one of the downsides of experts. They're often distant. Same thing with philosophers, right? Judges. They're really good at legal reasoning. They're really good at judicial decision-making. They're not always the best at thinking about the effects on people. Politicians have to think about people all the time. That's what they're doing. So, overall, democracy, not so great, a policy-making point of view, good from a checking power point of view. Non-democracy, technocracy, philosophy, dictatorship, all work pretty well for making decisions. In the end, we have a system that balances democracy and non-democracy. And we have a system that balances effective policymaking versus limited government. And that's actually one of the things that is kind of an overall value here. Effective policy, there's nothing that's more effective than a dictatorship. And there's nothing that's less limited than a dictatorship. So what we have overall, we have a systemic balance. And that, in fact, is the way that the founding generation wanted it. This is the way that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention wanted it. One of the fundamental problems they were facing was, we need an effective national government to solve the collective problems that the states have to help this fragile, young nation that just won its independence grow strong enough to maintain its independence and to be effective. We need that. We need effective policymaking. But we're afraid of a powerful national government. We're afraid that we're going to create a new British government, a new British monarchy of some kind that we just want our independence from. We don't want to create a Frankenstein's monster. And so what we're going to do is we're going to balance these two values. We need power, but we also need protection. Effective policymaking comes from non-democratic institutions, the presidency, independent agencies, the judiciary. Limited government is best protected by democracy. Nobody protects the people's interests against government tyranny better than the people themselves. When you have a status quo orientation or gridlock, that is limited government. That keeps the government out of our lives too much. Now, part of the problem is this. The government is the solution to many of our problems. And, as President Reagan famously said, sometimes the government is the problem. He exaggerated it. So, the real quote that President Reagan said was, "In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem." He said, "in the present crisis," which means that in a particular context, the government is not what we want. We want limited government. That actually implies, I don't think Reagan necessarily meant this, but that implies that in some crises, the government is the solution to our problem. When it comes to obesity, the government is probably the solution to our problem, not the problem itself, right? Better regulation. In fact, New York City just took the first steps toward, not the first steps, but a major step towards this by limiting the size of soft drinks that can be sold, right? No longer the Gigundo super big gulpy gulp can be purchased, right? It has to be, I think 16 ounces is the maximum size soda you can now buy in New York City at one time. Now, of course, you can buy 6 of them, but when you buy a 16-ounce soda and you drink it and you're like, oh, I'm done, and then you have to go pay another $1 to buy another 16-ounce soda, you're going to drink less soda. In that crisis, the government probably is the solution to our problem. The government both is the problem and is the solution to our problem. And so we have a system aimed at doing both of those things.